Sometimes the strongest among us are the ones who've learned what it means to be truly alone. In the high mountains of Wyoming Territory, an elderly widow needed shelter before winter buried the valley, and 28 men told her it couldn't be done. They tried and quit. The frozen ground defeated them. The bitter wind broke their resolve. Then a mountain man who'd refused every request for years heard her quiet plea and did something nobody expected. He built that cabin in 14 days, working alone through storms and cold that would break most men. When he finished, he didn't ask for thanks or payment. He simply walked away. What made this solitary man, who'd turned his back on everyone, finally say yes to one old woman's desperate wish? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha Brennan woke each morning to the sound of canvas snapping in the wind. The tent she called home shuddered against the cold that swept down from the mountain peaks, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. She was 67 years old, and her bones remembered every hard season she'd ever lived through. This one, she knew in her marrow, would be different. This one might be her last if she didn't find proper shelter before the snows came to stay. She pulled Samuel's old wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fabric had worn thin over the years, faded from the deep blue it had been when he'd bought it for her on their wedding day 43 years ago. The shawl still smelled faintly of him, or perhaps that was just her memory playing tricks. Samuel had been gone 3 years now, taken by a fever that came on sudden and left her alone in a world that had little patience for elderly widows with no sons to speak for them. The tent sat on 10 acres of land at the edge of Timber Ridge, a growing settlement in the Wyoming Territory where the mountains met the high valley. It wasn't much, that patch of ground, but it was hers. Samuel had bought it with honest money, and the deed had his name on it, and hers too, written in the careful script of the land office clerk. She'd moved here after selling their store in town, unable to keep the business running alone, unable to bear the pity in people's eyes when they came in and saw her struggling with tasks Samuel had made look easy. The tent had been meant as temporary shelter, while she arranged for something better. That was 2 years ago. Somehow temporary had become permanent, and with each passing season, the likelihood of anything changing grew smaller. Martha stepped outside into the October morning, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern peaks with rose and gold, and for a moment she let herself appreciate the beauty of it. Samuel had always said that a person who couldn't find something beautiful in each day was a person who'd given up on living. She wasn't ready to give up yet. She walked to the clearing where she'd stacked lumber over the summer, pine boards and hewn logs, purchased with the last of her savings from the store. Enough material, the timber merchant had assured her, to build a small cabin. 1 room with a loft, a proper stone fireplace, real windows with glass panes she'd ordered from back east. It would be snug and tight and warm, a place where she could live out her days with dignity instead of charity. All she needed was someone to build it. The first men had come in late August, 3 carpenters from Timber Ridge who took her deposit and promised to have the cabin finished before the first frost. They dug foundation holes, laid out the dimensions, and spent 2 days arguing about the best way to proceed before admitting the job was bigger than they'd thought. They returned half her deposit and recommended she hire a full crew. The full crew lasted 4 days. The ground was already hardening as autumn set in, and the logs were heavy, and the site was remote enough that hauling water for mixing mortar became a daily ordeal. The foreman told her kindly but firmly that the cabin would have to wait until spring, and by then, of course, the snow would have collapsed her tent, and she'd have been forced to accept someone's offer of a spare room in town. She'd tried again in September, hiring 2 farmers who needed off-season work. They were strong men, willing and honest, but they lacked the skill for proper construction. Their attempts at framing looked crooked, even to Martha's untrained eye. After a week of effort that produced nothing usable, they apologized and moved on to other work. Word spread through Timber Ridge and the surrounding settlements. The widow Brennan wanted a cabin built before winter. The job paid fair wages. The materials were already on site, yet somehow no one could manage it. The excuses varied: ground too hard, weather too unpredictable, location too remote, timeline too ambitious, but the result was always the same. They'd start with confidence and quit within days. 28 men in total. Martha kept count in the ledger book that had belonged to Samuel, the same book where he'd recorded every transaction at their store. She wrote each man's name, the dates they worked, and the reason they gave for leaving. The list grew longer as September turned to October, and the morning frosts began to linger past midday. The ledger itself was a painful reminder of better times. Page after page showed Samuel's neat handwriting, documenting sales and purchases, but also noting debts forgiven and credit extended. Paid in full, he'd write beside a name, even though Martha knew the customer had paid nothing. Samuel had believed that a merchant was also a member of the community, and that sometimes keeping your neighbors fed and clothed mattered more than keeping accounts balanced. Those same neighbors now passed her tent without stopping. The families Samuel had helped through hard winters, the men he'd extended credit to when mines closed or cattle died, the women whose children he'd given candy to, even when they couldn't afford to buy anything else. They remembered his kindness with fondness, but seemed to have forgotten that his widow still lived at the edge of their town, still needed the same compassion Samuel had shown so freely. Martha didn't blame them. Not exactly. People had their own troubles, their own families to worry about. The world was hard, and folks did what they needed to do to survive. She understood that. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any lighter or the approaching winter any less frightening. She returned to the tent and opened the ledger to a fresh page. October 10th, 1883. 28 failures recorded. She ran her finger down the list of names, recognizing each one. Good men, mostly. Not lazy or dishonest, just unable or unwilling to see the job through. At the bottom of the page, she wrote a single sentence in her own less practiced hand. I will not beg for charity. I will not abandon Samuel's land. I will not give up. She closed the book and wrapped it carefully in oilcloth, then placed it in the wooden chest that held her few precious possessions. Samuel's pocket watch, its gold case worn smooth from years in his vest. Her mother's wedding ring, too small now for her swollen knuckles. A tintype photograph of Samuel and herself on their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful and impossibly naive about what life would bring. And at the bottom of the chest, beneath everything else, the deed to her land. She took it out and unfolded the stiff paper, reading the legal description of her property. 10 acres, more or less, bounded on the north by Timber Ridge Creek, on the east by territorial land, on the south by the wagon road, and on the west by the rising slope of the mountains. 10 acres. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and she'd die before she let anyone take it from her. Martha folded the deed carefully and returned it to the chest. The morning was wearing on, and she had work to do, firewood to gather, water to haul from the creek, a rabbit stew to prepare from yesterday's successful snare. Life went on, cabin or no cabin, and she'd learned long ago that survival meant doing the next thing that needed doing, and then the next thing after that, until eventually you'd made it through another day. She pulled on her worn boots and stepped outside again, lifting her face to the sun. The sky was clear and blue, but she could feel the change coming. A week, maybe 2, before the weather turned for good. After that, any hope of building before spring would be gone. Martha picked up her water buckets and started down the path toward Timber Ridge Creek. The walk took 15 minutes each way, and her back ached by the time she returned with full buckets. But she'd learned to pace herself and rest when needed. She was old, not helpless. There was a difference, though the world seemed determined to forget it. As she crested the small rise before her tent, she saw him. A man standing at the edge of her lumber pile, running his hand along one of the logs. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and wool, with a thick beard going grey and eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to look directly at anything. She knew who he was, though they'd never spoken. Everyone in Timber Ridge knew of Silas Creighton, the mountain man who lived somewhere up in the high country and came to town perhaps twice a year for supplies. He spoke to no one except the trading post owner, paid in cash or furs, and left before anyone could engage him in conversation. Martha set down her buckets and waited. Silas turned to look at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he nodded once, a brief acknowledgement, and turned his attention back to the lumber. "Good timber," he said finally. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "Pine. Properly seasoned. Someone knew what they were doing when they selected this." "My husband," Martha said. "He ordered it before he died." Silas nodded again, still examining the wood. "I heard you've been trying to get a cabin built." 28 men tried. 28 men quit." "I heard that too." Martha waited, but he didn't say anything more. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. "Did you come to tell me it can't be done?" she asked finally. "Because I've heard that speech enough times." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "No," he said. "I came to tell you. I'll build your cabin." Martha felt her heart stumble in her chest. "Why?" "Because you need it built," he said simply, "and because I can do it. I can't pay much, maybe not anything, after what I've spent already on the others. I'm not asking for payment." Martha studied his face, searching for the trick, the condition, the inevitable disappointment. She'd lived too long and been let down too many times to accept kindness at face value. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't help anyone in Timber Ridge. That's what people say about you." Silas was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains. "People say a lot of things," he said finally. "Most of it's true. I don't help this town because this town didn't help me when I needed it. But you're not asking for help out of greed or laziness. You're asking because you need to survive the winter with your dignity intact." "That's different." He turned back to face her. "I'll start tomorrow at first light. It'll take 2 weeks, maybe less if the weather holds. I'll need you to stay out of the way while I work, but I won't turn down a hot meal if you're offering." Martha felt tears threatening and forced them back. She'd cried enough over the past 3 years. "Thank you," she managed. Silas nodded once more, then walked past her toward the tree line. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew the land, who belonged to it in a way that couldn't be taught or faked. Martha watched him disappear into the forest, then looked at her lumber pile, seeing it differently now. Not a monument to failure, but the beginning of something that might actually happen. She picked up her water buckets and carried them to the tent, her back somehow not aching quite as much as before. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow it begins. The next morning arrived with a frost so heavy it looked like snow had already fallen. Martha woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay in her bedroll, listening to the silence that came with deep cold. No bird sang yet. No wind stirred the canvas. The world held its breath, waiting for the sun to release it. She rose and dressed quickly, layering every piece of clothing she owned. The cold had teeth this morning, and she could see her breath inside the tent. Winter was announcing its approach, giving fair warning to those wise enough to listen. By the time she'd started a fire and put coffee on to boil, the sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. She stood by the flames, warming her hands, when she heard the sound of footsteps crunching through the frost-stiff grass. Silas emerged from the trees carrying an axe over one shoulder and a leather tool bag in his other hand. He moved with purpose, his breath clouding in the cold air, his eyes already assessing the site and the materials. "Morning," he said, setting down his bag near the lumber pile. "Coffee's almost ready," Martha replied. "Appreciated." She poured 2 tin cups and brought one to him. He accepted it with a nod and drank it black and hot, his gaze never leaving the building site. Martha could almost see his mind working, calculating angles and measurements, planning the sequence of tasks that would transform her pile of lumber into a home. "You'll want to stay in your tent today," he said, after finishing the coffee. "I'll be moving materials around, cutting pieces. Dangerous work. No point in you being nearby." "I can help." "You can help by staying safe," he interrupted, not unkindly. "I work alone. Always have." Martha wanted to argue, to assert that it was her cabin and her land, and she had every right to be part of the building process. But something in his tone told her that arguing would accomplish nothing. Silas Crichton had agreed to build her cabin on his terms, and those terms included working without interference. "I'll have lunch ready at midday," she said instead. He nodded and turned his attention to the lumber, running his hands over each log and board, examining them with the care of a man who understood that the quality of materials determined the quality of the finished work. Martha retreated to her tent and busied herself with mending. Through the canvas walls, she could hear the rhythmic sound of Silas's axe biting into wood, the scrape of logs being moved, the occasional grunt of effort. She forced herself not to peek outside every few minutes, though the temptation was strong. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, bringing a little warmth, but not enough to truly soften the cold. Martha prepared a simple lunch of beans and cornbread, then stepped outside to call Silas. He was standing in what would become the center of the cabin, surrounded by logs he'd arranged in a precise pattern. 4 corners were marked with stakes, and he'd stretched twine between them to establish the dimensions. 20 feet by 16 feet, she estimated. Not large, but sufficient. "Lunch is ready," she called. Silas straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. He'd removed his coat while working, and his shirt was damp with exertion. He walked to where she'd set out the food on a flat rock near the fire, sat without ceremony, and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed meals as fuel rather than pleasure. "You've made progress," Martha observed, sitting across from him. "Foundation work," he said between bites. "Most important part of any building. Get the foundation wrong, and nothing above it will be right. The other men, they rushed this part. Wanted to see walls going up so they could feel like they were accomplishing something." And you don't need to feel like you're accomplishing something? He gave her a look that might have been amusement. I know I'm accomplishing something. Don't need to feel it. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Martha watched him covertly, trying to understand this strange man who'd appeared out of nowhere to help her. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with tools and weapons. His face was weathered, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, but his eyes themselves were sharp and clear. "Why did the town fail you?" she asked suddenly. Silas stopped eating and looked at her. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some boundary. But then he set down his plate and spoke in that rough, unused voice. 15 years ago, I had a wife and a daughter. We lived in Timber Ridge. I was the best carpenter in the territory. Built half the buildings in that town. Made good money, had a good life. He paused, staring into the fire. Then the fever came. Same one that took your Samuel, maybe, or something like it. My daughter got sick first. She was 6 years old. Martha's heart clenched, but she said nothing, letting him continue at his own pace. I went to every family I'd ever helped, everyone who owed me money or favors. Asked them to sit with my daughter while I went for the doctor in Laramie. 3 days' ride there and back. My wife was sick too by then. Couldn't manage alone. His jaw tightened. Every single person said no. Too afraid of catching the fever themselves. Too worried about their own families. Oh, Silas. By the time I got back with the doctor, they were both dead. Buried by the minister because no one else would go near our house. He looked at Martha, and she saw the old anger and grief still burning behind his eyes. I left that same day. Built a cabin up in the high country, where I wouldn't have to see any of their faces again. And I swore I'd never lift a finger to help Timber Ridge, no matter what they asked. Martha felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago. Pain like that doesn't care about time. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of it. No, it doesn't. Then why are you here? Why help me? Silas stood and brushed the crumbs from his pants. Because you're not them. You're someone who got left behind, same as I was. And because if I let you freeze to death in that tent when I could have done something about it, then I'm no better than the people who let my family die. He picked up his axe and returned to work, leaving Martha by the fire with tears drying on her face and a better understanding of the complicated man who'd agreed to save her life. The afternoon brought more sounds of construction. Silas dug foundation holes with a metal bar and a shovel, breaking through the frost-hardened earth with patient, persistent effort. The work was brutal. Martha could tell that much even from a distance, but he never stopped, never slowed, never showed any sign of giving up. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Martha heard different sounds. Hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching from the direction of town. She emerged from her tent to see 5 riders coming up the wagon road. She recognized them immediately. The first 3 men who'd quit her cabin job back in August, along with 2 others she knew from town. The lead rider was Jake Sutter, a carpenter who'd taken her deposit money and returned half of it after 2 days of work. They reined in their horses near the building site, and Jake called out to Silas, who'd stopped working and now stood with his axe resting on his shoulder. "Heard you took on the widow's cabin job," Jake said, his tone carrying something that wasn't quite mockery, but wasn't quite friendly either. "That's right," Silas replied. "Thought you might like to know it can't be done. Not before winter. Ground's too hard, weather's too unpredictable. We tried, all of us tried. No shame in admitting when a job's beyond a man's capability. I'm not a man who gives up on jobs, Silas said quietly. Jake shifted in his saddle, and Martha saw something flicker across his face. Annoyance? Concern? You trying to make us look bad, Creighton? That what this is about? This isn't about you at all. It's about her. Silas gestured toward Martha with his axe. She needs a cabin. I'm building her one. What you did or didn't do doesn't concern me. Well, it concerns us, one of the other men spoke up. His name was Henry Pierce, and he owned the dry goods store in town. People are talking, saying if the hermit can build it, why couldn't the rest of us? It's not good for business. People questioning our capability. Martha stepped forward, anger rising in her chest. Maybe if you'd put half as much effort into actually building as you're putting into making excuses, the cabin would already be finished. Jake's face darkened. Now hold on, Mrs. Brennan. We did our best. Your best was 2 days, she snapped. 2 days before you decided your reputation was more valuable than my life. That's not fair. What's not fair is me paying good money to men who took it and ran the moment the work got difficult. Martha's voice shook, but not with fear, with fury that had been building for weeks. What's not fair is facing winter in a tent because 28 men couldn't be bothered to follow through on their word. The riders exchanged glances, uncomfortable now. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Silas spoke first. You're done here, he said flatly. Ride back to town. Tell people whatever you want about me or this job. I don't care, but don't come back to this site again. There was something in his tone, some quality of absolute certainty that made even Jake Sutter think twice about arguing. The 5 men turned their horses without another word and rode back down the wagon road, leaving dust hanging in the cold air. Martha watched them go, her hands trembling with anger and something else. Fear, perhaps, that their visit was just the beginning of trouble. They'll talk, she said to Silas. Let them talk. He returned to his work, driving the metal bar into the frozen ground with sharp, powerful strikes. Talk never built anything worth having. That evening, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Martha brought Silas a plate of stew and fresh bread. He'd worked until he could no longer see, and had managed to dig all 4 corner foundation holes, despite the brutal conditions. You should stop for the night, she said, handing him the food. You'll work yourself into exhaustion. I've got 2 weeks to build this cabin, he replied, accepting the plate. That means every hour of daylight counts, and some hours after dark, too. 2 weeks? You said maybe less if the weather held. Weather won't hold, he interrupted. Big storms coming. I can feel it in my bones. Week from now, maybe 10 days. After that, we'll be racing against snow. Martha felt her hope flicker. Can you really finish in time? Silas looked at her in the firelight, his face half in shadow. I can if nothing else goes wrong. But Mrs. Brennan, I need you to understand something. Those men who came today, they're not going to let this go. They're going to cause problems, try to interfere, maybe even sabotage the work. People don't like being shown up, especially by someone they've written off as a hermit and a fool. What can we do? We keep working. We don't engage with them. And we trust that when the cabin's finished, their words won't matter anymore. He paused, then added, You might want to keep that deed of yours somewhere safe, in a place where you can get to it quick if you need to. A chill ran down Martha's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. You think they'd try to take my land? I think desperate people do desperate things, and I think some folks in Timber Ridge might prefer you gone, one way or another. Martha thought of Samuel's pocket watch, her mother's ring, the deed to her property, all sitting in the chest in her tent. She'd always thought of them as memories, precious things to be protected from the elements. Now she realized they might need to be protected from something far more dangerous than weather. "I'll keep it close," she promised. Silas nodded and turned his attention to his food. They sat together in the firelight, two people who'd been abandoned by the world they'd once trusted, now depending on each other to survive what was coming. Above them, the stars blazed cold and clear, and somewhere in the darkness, the first whisper of wind carried the scent of distant snow. The storm arrived on the 5th day of construction, rolling down from the high peaks with a fury that caught even Silas by surprise. One moment the sky was merely grey and threatening. The next, it was unleashing wind and sleet with a violence that sent all three of them, Martha, Silas, and Thomas, scrambling for the shelter of Martha's tent. They huddled inside as the canvas walls shuddered and snapped, the poles creaking ominously under the assault. Rain mixed with ice pelted down, turning the ground into a treacherous mix of mud and frost. Outside, Martha could hear loose items being thrown about by the wind, a bucket clattering, tools scraping across rock. "The cabin," Thomas said anxiously. "Will it be all right?" "The work we've done is solid," Silas assured him. 4 walls halfway up, corner posts braced, roof beams positioned. Wind might knock some things around, but the structure will hold. Martha wasn't sure she believed him, but she appreciated the calm certainty in his voice. They settled in to wait out the storm, which showed no signs of abating as morning turned to afternoon. In the forced intimacy of the small tent, with nothing to do but listen to the wind howl, conversation became inevitable. Thomas asked questions about building techniques, about the best way to join logs, about how to calculate angles for a roof. Silas answered patiently, sometimes using sticks or stones to illustrate his explanations. But eventually, Thomas's curiosity turned to more personal matters. "Silas," he asked hesitantly, "why did you stop building? Before, I mean. When you lived in town." Martha tensed, worried that the question might anger Silas or bring up painful memories, but he simply sat back against the tent pole and stared at the canvas ceiling for a long moment. "I stopped because building things for people who didn't care about anything but themselves started to feel like a waste," he said finally. "I'd put my heart into making homes for folks, real homes built to last generations. And then I'd watch those same folks turn their backs on neighbors in need, close their doors to people who were suffering, hoard what they had instead of sharing it." "Like when your family got sick," Thomas said quietly. Silas looked at the boy sharply. "Who told you about that?" "My ma. She said it was the worst thing the town ever did, turning away from you when you needed help. She said she was young then, too young to stand up to her own parents and the other adults. But she's regretted it ever since." Silas's expression softened slightly. "Your ma was just a girl. Can't blame children for what their parents chose. But you blame the town. I blame the people who made the choice to let my wife and daughter die alone." Silas's voice was steady, but edged with old pain. "And yes, I blame the town for becoming the kind of place where that choice was acceptable." Martha spoke up then, needing to share her own understanding. "Samuel used to say that a community is only as strong as its willingness to help the weakest among them. He said that's what separated civilization from savagery, the choice to care for people who couldn't necessarily give you anything in return." "Your Samuel was a wise man," Silas said. "He was. But the town forgot his lessons after he died. They remembered him fondly, talked about what a good man he'd been, but they didn't practice what he'd taught them." Martha felt tears threatening, but held them back. They let me struggle because it was easier than helping, because helping would have required effort and sacrifice, and those things are harder than fond memories. The three of them sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Then Silas reached into his coat and pulled out something Martha had never seen him carry, a tarnished military medal on a faded ribbon. "I don't talk about this much," he said, holding the medal so they could see it. "But since we're stuck here together sharing truths, might as well share this one too." Thomas leaned forward, fascinated. "You were a soldier? Cavalry scout? Fought in the Indian Wars, though I'm not proud of everything I did during those years. Was decorated for bravery, which mostly meant I survived when others didn't." He turned the medal over in his weathered hands. Learned a lot about tactics and strategy, about how to read terrain and weather, about how to plan 3 moves ahead of your enemy. "Is that why you work the way you do?" Martha asked. "Always thinking ahead, always prepared." "Partly, but mostly it's because the military taught me that success isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being the smartest and the most persistent. It's about understanding that every decision you make now affects what happens later, and that cutting corners always costs more in the end than doing things right the first time." He handed the medal to Thomas, letting the boy examine it. "Your pa and the others who tried to build this cabin, they weren't thinking ahead. They were reacting to problems as they came up instead of anticipating them. That's why they failed. Not because they were weak or incompetent, but because they didn't know how to plan for all the things that could go wrong." "Will you teach me that?" Thomas asked. "How to think ahead like that?" "I'm already teaching you. Every time I explain why we're doing something a certain way, every time I show you how one step leads to the next, that's teaching you to think strategically." Silas took the medal back and returned it to his pocket. "Building isn't just about hammering nails and cutting wood. It's about seeing the finished structure in your mind before you've placed the first log, and then working backward to figure out each step needed to make that vision real." The storm continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Martha prepared a meal from the supplies the women had brought, and they ate together in the dim light of a single lantern. The temperature inside the tent dropped steadily as night fell, and they huddled close to share warmth. "Tell me about your wife," Martha said softly to Silas, "if it's not too painful." Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and distant. "Her name was Catherine. We met when I was 23, just starting out as a carpenter. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper, and she had the most beautiful laugh, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. We married within 6 months, which everyone said was too fast. But we knew. Some things you just know." He paused, lost in memory. "She had patience I never possessed, could calm me down when I got frustrated with a difficult job, could make me see solutions I'd missed because I was too close to the problem. And she loved our daughter, Clara, with a fierceness that amazed me. Would do anything to keep that girl safe and happy." "Clara," Martha repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name. She was a beautiful child, curious like Thomas here, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. She'd follow me around the workshop, handing me tools before I asked for them, memorizing the names of every piece of wood and metal." His voice caught slightly. "She would have been 21 now, probably married, maybe with children of her own." Thomas was silent, his young face grave with understanding. Martha reached out and placed her hand over Silas's weathered one. "They would be proud of you," she said. for helping me, for teaching Thomas, for not letting bitterness completely consume you." "I let it consume me for 15 years, Silas replied. "Only reason I'm here now is because I looked at you, standing alone by that lumber pile, and saw myself, someone who'd been abandoned by people who should have cared. Couldn't walk away from that, no matter how much I wanted to stay angry at the world." The storm began to ease as full darkness fell, the wind dropping from a howl to a steady blow, the rain turning to a light drizzle. Silas stood and peered outside through the tent flap. "Worst is over," he announced. "We'll be able to get back to work tomorrow, though the ground will be a mess." "Should I go home?" Thomas asked reluctantly. "Too dark and too dangerous," Martha said firmly. "You'll stay here tonight, and we'll send word to your parents first thing in the morning so they don't worry." The boy nodded, clearly relieved. Martha suspected he didn't want to leave anyway, didn't want to miss whatever might happen next in this strange adventure that had taken over his life. They settled in for the night, arranging bedrolls and blankets as best they could in the cramped space. Martha found herself thinking about what Silas had shared, about the wife and daughter he'd lost, about the pain that had driven him into isolation for so many years. And she thought about how strange life was, how it could take two people who'd been broken by loss and bring them together in a way that might help them both heal. Not completely. Some wounds never fully closed, but enough to keep living, to keep trying, to keep building something worth having. Outside, the storm's last whispers faded into silence, and the night grew cold and clear. Above the valley, stars emerged one by one, ancient lights that had witnessed countless human struggles and survivals. Tomorrow they would assess the damage and continue the work. Tomorrow they would raise more walls and move closer to completion. Tomorrow they would face whatever challenges came, just as they'd faced everything else, together, persistent, and refusing to quit. For now, though, they simply rested, three people who'd found each other by accident and were becoming something like a family by choice. Morning revealed both relief and new challenges. The cabin structure had survived the storm intact, just as Silas had predicted, but the ground had turned into a quagmire of mud and standing water. Everything would take longer now, each step requiring twice the effort as they slogged through the mire. Thomas left at dawn to reassure his parents he was safe, promising to return by mid-morning. Martha and Silas surveyed the work site, taking stock of what needed to be done. "We lost a day," Silas observed, "but we didn't lose any work. That's what matters." The walls stood at half-height now, 4 solid courses of logs notched and fitted together with the precision that was Silas's trademark. The structure already looked like it might become a cabin, rather than just a pile of lumber. Martha felt her hope strengthen at the sight of it. They spent the morning clearing water from the foundation, repositioning materials that had shifted in the storm, and preparing for the afternoon's work. Thomas returned as promised, bringing news from town that made both adults exchange concerned glances. "Pa says Jake Sutter's been drinking at the saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that Silas must be cutting corners to work so fast," the boy reported. "He's saying the cabin will fall down first winter, and then you'll sue everyone who refused to build it, claiming they knew it was impossible." "That's ridiculous," Martha said. "Doesn't matter if it's ridiculous," Silas replied. "What matters is whether people believe it. Fear makes folks do stupid things, and Sutter's stoking fear. What can we do? Nothing. We keep building, and when the cabin's finished and sound, the truth will be obvious." He handed Thomas a measuring cord. "Come on, boy. Time to learn about roof beams." The afternoon's work focused on the massive central beam that would support the entire roof structure. It was a perfect piece of timber, straight, strong, without flaw, and Silas treated it with particular care. He showed Thomas how to mark the beam for notches that would accept the rafters, explaining the mathematics of angles and weight distribution. A roof is where most builders fail, Silas said as they worked. They think it just sits on top like a hat on a head. But a roof is active. It's constantly pushing outward against the walls, trying to spread them apart. You have to design it so those forces balance, so the weight goes down through the posts, into the ground, instead of sideways against the walls. Thomas listened intently, asking questions that showed he was really thinking about the concepts. Martha watched them work together and saw how natural their relationship had become. Teacher and student, but also something more. Thomas was filling a void in Silas's life, she realized, the empty space where his daughter should have been. And Silas was giving Thomas something his own father couldn't: patient instruction combined with genuine respect for the boy's intelligence. Around mid-afternoon, Robert Patterson appeared at the work site. He didn't announce himself, just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching his son help position the central beam into place. Martha saw him first and tensed, expecting confrontation. But Robert just watched, his face unreadable. After several minutes, he walked closer, and Thomas noticed him. "Pa," the boy said, uncertain whether to be glad or worried. "Don't stop on my account," Robert replied. "I want to see how this is done." Silas glanced at him briefly, then returned his attention to the beam. "Thomas, check the level on the east end. Tell me what you see." Thomas scrambled to do as instructed, peering at the small bubble in the carpenter's level. "A hair high, maybe." "How much is a hair?" About the width of my fingernail." "That's too much. What do we do?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Shim the west end. Raise it to match." "Good thinking. Show me." Martha watched as Thomas carefully selected a thin piece of wood and slid it under the western support, then checked the level again. His face lit up when the bubble centered perfectly. "That's it," Silas confirmed. "Now we lock it in place." He drove a heavy wooden peg through a pre-drilled hole, securing the beam permanently. A good builder checks everything twice, fixes problems when they're small, and never assumes anything is right just because it looks right. Robert moved closer, examining the work. "That's fine craftsmanship," he said quietly. "Better than I've seen in most buildings in Timber Ridge." "Your boy helped," Silas replied. "He's got good hands and a good mind. Listens well, doesn't make the same mistake twice." Pride flickered across Robert's face, followed by something that might have been shame. "I should have taught him myself. Should have taken the time. You still can. I'm teaching him building. But there's plenty else a boy needs to learn that only his father can teach." Silas straightened and faced Robert directly. "Teaching isn't about knowing everything. It's about sharing what you do know and being honest about what you don't. Boy respects honesty more than he respects perfection." The two men looked at each other for a long moment, some unspoken understanding passing between them. Then Robert nodded and turned to his son. "I was wrong to resent you coming here," he said. "I was letting my pride get in the way of what was best for you. I'm sorry for that." Thomas looked like he might cry, but he held it together. "It's all right, Pa." "No, it's not. But I'm going to do better." Robert looked back at Silas. "Thank you for teaching him, and for not making him choose between respecting you and respecting me." "No man worth following would make a boy choose that," Silas replied. After Robert left, the work continued with renewed energy. Thomas seemed to stand a little taller, work a little harder, as if his father's approval had unlocked something inside him. They finished positioning all the major roof beams by the time the sun touched the western peaks, and the cabin finally looked like what it was meant to be, a real home-taking shape. That evening, as they shared a meal by the fire, Martha pulled out her recipe book, the collection of handwritten recipes and household remedies she'd been compiling for 40 years. She'd been planning to use it someday when she had a real kitchen again, a real home where cooking was more than just survival. "Look at this," she said, showing them pages filled with her careful script. "Recipes from my mother, from Samuel's mother, from friends over the years. This one here," she pointed to a stained page, "is for apple butter, Samuel's favorite. I used to make it every fall, and he'd eat it on bread for breakfast every morning." "Will you make it again?" Thomas asked. "When the cabin's done?" "I will," Martha promised. "I'll make all of these again, and I'll teach them to anyone who wants to learn, just like Silas is teaching you carpentry." Thomas smiled. "My ma would love that. She's always complaining she can't get her bread to rise properly." "Then she'll be my first student," Martha declared. Silas watched them talk, and Martha saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Contentment, perhaps, or the beginning of peace. He'd spent 15 years running from human connection, from the pain of losing what he'd loved. But here, in the process of building her cabin, he was finding his way back to the world. And she was finding her way too. Not back to what she'd lost, that was gone forever, but forward to something new. A different life than the one she'd imagined, but perhaps a good one nonetheless. The next day would bring more challenges, more work, more risks. But tonight, beside the fire with her strange new family, Martha Brennan felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt hope. The cabin was nearly complete when Martha found the papers. She'd been sorting through Samuel's old documents, preparing to move them from the tent to her new home, when a leather portfolio she didn't recognize fell from the bottom of the wooden chest. The portfolio was sealed with wax, and written across it in Samuel's hand were the words, "For Martha, to be opened only in case of my death or dire need." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside were documents she'd never seen before, surveys, land plats, legal descriptions written in the formal language of territorial law, and at the center of it all, a deed. Not the deed to 10 acres she'd always known about. This was different. Martha read it once, then twice, then a third time before the truth fully settled in her mind. The land she'd been living on, the land she thought was a modest patch at the edge of nowhere, was actually 200 acres. 200 acres that included not just the clearing where her tent stood, but the entire forested hillside behind it, a substantial portion of Timber Ridge Creek with its water rights, and most importantly, a stand of old-growth timber that any lumber company would pay handsomely to harvest. She sat back, stunned. Samuel had hidden this from her. Why? To protect her? To keep her from being targeted by those who might want the land? As she read further through the documents, she found her answer in a letter Samuel had written, but had never sent to the Territorial Land Office. "I have become aware," he wrote, "that certain men in Timber Ridge have expressed interest in acquiring timberland through any means necessary, including driving out current owners through deliberate hardship. I will not put this deed in my wife's name during my lifetime, as it would make her a target. Instead, I have arranged with my lawyer that the full deed will pass to her automatically upon my death, with the understanding that she may not know of its existence until she has need of it." Martha felt her world tilt. The 28 men who'd failed to build her cabin, had some of them known? Had they been trying to make her fail, to force her to abandon the land so they could claim it was unused and therefore available for territorial reassignment. She thought back over each failed attempt, seeing them in a new light. Jake Sutter's hasty departure after just 2 days, the various excuses that all sounded reasonable but added up to something else. The way some of the men had urged her to move to town, to give up on the foolish idea of living alone. How many of them had been trying to help her fail. Martha grabbed the documents and ran from the tent, her heart pounding. Silas and Thomas were working on the cabin's roof, laying shingles with careful precision. She called up to them, her voice sharp with urgency. "Silas, I need to speak with you, now." Something in her tone brought him down immediately. Thomas followed, sensing the gravity of the situation. Martha spread the documents on a flat rock and showed them what she'd found. Silas read through everything carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he was silent for a long moment. "How many of the 28 men who quit knew about this?" Martha demanded. "How many were trying to sabotage me?" "Hard to say for certain," Silas replied slowly, "but I'd wager at least 3 or 4 of them. Maybe more." He pointed to one of the documents. "This survey map. See how it shows the timber stand? That's valuable. Very valuable. Worth killing for. To some men." "Killing?" Thomas's eyes went wide. "Figure of speech," Silas said quickly, but Martha saw something in his face that suggested he wasn't entirely sure it was just a figure of speech. "What do I do?" Martha asked. "If people know about this, do they know? That's the question." Silas studied the documents again. "Your Samuel was careful. This portfolio was sealed, hidden. The full deed is probably only registered with the Territorial Land Office in Laramie, not the local clerk. So unless someone went digging through records there—" "Jake Sutter's brother works in the Laramie Land Office," Thomas interrupted. "Everyone knows that. Pa does business with him sometimes when he needs to file claims." Martha and Silas exchanged glances. "Then they know," Silas said flatly. "Or at least Jake Sutter knows. And if he knows, others probably do too." "But I'm building the cabin," Martha said, trying to think through the implications. "I'm improving the land, occupying it. They can't claim it's abandoned now." "No, but they can claim the deed is fraudulent. They can tie you up in legal challenges for years, cost you money you don't have, make your life miserable until you give up and sell." Silas's jaw tightened. "Or they can try more direct methods." "You think they'd hurt her?" Thomas asked, horrified. "I think desperate men with money on the line are capable of anything." Silas began gathering the documents carefully. "Martha, you need to take these to the territorial marshal. Get them officially recorded and witnessed. Make it legal and public so there's no question about your ownership." "The marshal is in Laramie. That's 3 days' ride." "Then we send Thomas with them. He's young, fast, and nobody will pay attention to a boy on an errand." Silas looked at Thomas. "You up for this? It's important, and it might be dangerous if the wrong people figure out what you're carrying." Thomas straightened, trying to look brave. "I can do it. You'll need a good horse and supplies, and a cover story in case anyone asks." Silas thought for a moment. "Tell people your pa's sending you to visit your aunt in Laramie. Take the documents hidden in your saddlebag. Once you're there, go straight to the marshal's office. Give him everything, explain the situation, and ask for an official witness to the deed transfer." "But that will take days," Martha protested. "The cabin's nearly done. If they're going to make a move, they'll make it whether we're ready or not," Silas said grimly. "At least this way you'll have legal protection, and someone official will know what's happening out here if things go wrong." Martha wanted to argue, to find some other solution that didn't involve sending a 12-year-old boy on a dangerous mission. But she could see from Silas's expression that he'd already considered every option, and this was the best one. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "But Thomas, you tell your parents the truth. I won't have them thinking I put you at risk without their knowledge." Thomas nodded and took off running toward town. Martha and Silas stood in silence, watching him go. The cabin loomed behind them, so close to finished, but suddenly feeling fragile, threatened. "Silas," Martha said quietly, "what did you mean by 'if things go wrong'?" He turned to look at her, and she saw in his eyes the soldier he'd once been. Tactical, calculating, prepared for violence. "I meant that if Jake Sutter and whoever's working with him decide they can't win legally, they might try to ensure there's no cabin to prove occupancy. Fire, sabotage, or worse." "You think they'd burn it?" "I think we should be ready for anything." He gestured toward the surrounding forest. "We're isolated out here. No neighbors close enough to hear if there's trouble. No law nearby to intervene. We're on our own." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd been so focused on survival, on getting shelter before winter, that she hadn't fully considered the human threats around her. But Silas had. He'd been watching, assessing, preparing. "We need to finish the cabin fast," he said. "Get you moved in, get a fire going in the hearth, make it absolutely clear you're in occupancy. The law's fuzzy about a lot of things, but a person living in their home has certain protections that someone camping on land doesn't." "How fast can we finish?" 2 days for the roof, 1 day for the door and windows, 1 day for the interior finishing. 4 days total if we work dawn to dark and nothing goes wrong." "And if something does go wrong?" Silas's hand rested on the handle of his axe, that beautiful hand-forged tool that she suddenly realized could serve as a weapon if needed. "Then we deal with it," he said simply. They returned to work with renewed urgency. Every board laid, every shingle nailed, every window frame fitted became an act of defiance against those who would take what was rightfully Martha's. The cabin grew more complete with each passing hour, transforming from a structure into a fortress. As the sun set that evening, painting the valley in shades of orange and gold, Martha stood inside the cabin for the first time. The roof was complete overhead, keeping out the elements. The walls were solid on all sides, offering protection. The stone fireplace stood ready for its first fire. It was almost home. But home, she was learning, was something you sometimes had to fight for, and the fight was just beginning. That night, Silas didn't return to his camp in the high country. He built his bedroll inside the unfinished cabin, positioned where he could watch both the door opening and the window spaces. He kept his axe close at hand, and Martha noticed he'd brought something else, a rifle, well-maintained and ready. "Get some rest," he told her. "I'll keep watch. Silas, you can't stay awake all night. I've done it before. I'll do it again." He settled against the wall, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Besides, I've got too much invested in this cabin to let someone burn it down now. It's the best work I've done in 15 years. Martha wanted to protest, to insist she could share the watch, but exhaustion was pulling at her, and she knew she'd be useless without sleep. She retreated to her tent one last time, knowing that soon, very soon, she'd be sleeping in her cabin, in her home, on her land that no one could take from her. If they could just survive the next few days. Outside, the night deepened and the temperature dropped. Somewhere in Timber Ridge, men were making plans. Somewhere on the road to Laramie, Thomas rode through the darkness, carrying documents that could change everything. and inside the nearly complete cabin, a mountain man kept watch over the home he'd built and the woman whose courage had called him down from his isolation. The battle for Martha Brennan's land had begun in earnest, and Silas Crichton wasn't planning to lose. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of morning that promised frost by nightfall. Martha woke to the smell of coffee and found Silas already working, installing the cabin's front door. The door was a masterpiece. Thick planks fitted seamlessly together, with a small window at eye level and Martha's initials carved into a decorative panel near the top. "You carved it," she said, running her fingers over the letters. Seemed fitting. A home should have the owner's mark on it. He adjusted the hinges, testing the swing. Doors important, not just for keeping out weather, for keeping out people who don't belong. Martha understood the subtext. The door wasn't just functional, it was defensive. Heavy enough to withstand force, positioned to give them warning of anyone approaching. They worked through the morning with focused intensity. Windows were fitted and sealed, gaps between logs were chinked with clay and moss. The hearth was tested and pronounced sound. By midday the cabin was functionally complete, livable, secure, ready to be called home. "We should move your things in now," Silas said. "Establish occupancy before anything else happens." They dismantled Martha's tent and carried everything inside, her bedroll, her cooking supplies, the wooden chest with its precious contents. Martha arranged items on the shelves Silas had built into the walls, hung her shawl on a peg by the door, set Samuel's pocket watch on the mantel above the fireplace. "Light the hearth," Silas instructed. "Make it official." Martha knelt before the fireplace and built a fire from kindling and dry wood. As the flames caught and began to crackle, spreading warmth through the single room, she felt something shift inside her. This was her home now, her sanctuary, her stand against everything that had tried to break her. She stood and turned to find Silas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction at a job well done. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of it." "Thank me when we're sure you get to keep it," he replied. As if summoned by his words, they heard horses approaching, multiple riders, moving fast. Silas grabbed his rifle and positioned himself by the window, while Martha instinctively moved toward the chest where she'd hidden the deed documents, the copies Thomas hadn't taken to Laramie. 5 riders emerged from the tree line. Jake Sutter led them, flanked by Henry Pierce and Douglas Webb. The men Martha now knew had been behind the conspiracy to take her land. 2 others she recognized as drifters, the kind of men who hired out their fists and didn't ask questions about right or wrong. Silas opened the door and stepped outside, rifle held casually, but unmistakably ready. Martha followed, her heart hammering, but her resolve firm. "That's far enough," Silas called out when the riders were still 20 yards away. Jake reined in his horse, his face twisted with anger. "This is none of your concern, Crichton. This is between us and the widow. Everything that happens on this property is my concern, seeing as I built the structure you're looking at." Silas's voice was calm, almost conversational. "That cabin is sound and occupied. Mrs. Brennan is in legal possession of her land. Whatever you came here to do, I'd advise against it." "Legal possession?" Henry Pierce laughed harshly. "Based on what? A deed to 10 acres? That cabin sits on disputed land, and we have prior claim." "You have nothing," Martha said, stepping forward despite Silas's warning glance. "I know about the 200 acres. I know about the timber rights and the water access. And I know you've been trying to drive me off so you could claim it was abandoned." The men exchanged glances, confirming her suspicions. Jake's face darkened further. "Even if that deed exists," he said carefully, "it was never properly transferred. Samuel Brennan died before the paperwork was finalized. That makes it territorial land, open for claim. The deed was properly transferred through his will, Martha countered. It's legal and binding. Prove it, Douglas Webb spoke up. He was a lawyer's clerk, someone who understood enough about law to be dangerous. Show us the documents. Martha felt Silas's hand on her arm, a gentle warning. The documents are with the territorial marshal in Laramie, she said, being officially recorded and witnessed as we speak. Jake's expression shifted from anger to something more calculating. Laramie's 3 days away. A lot can happen in 3 days. Cabins burn. People get hurt. Sometimes accidents happen that nobody can prevent. That's a threat, Silas said quietly. And threats have consequences. What are you going to do, hermit? Shoot all 5 of us. You might get 1 or 2, but we'll get you. And then there's nothing between us and the widow. Jake leaned forward in his saddle. Walk away, Creighton. This isn't your fight. You've done your charity work. Now let us handle our business. This became my fight the moment I decided to build that cabin, Silas replied. His voice remained calm, but Martha heard the steel underneath. And I don't leave jobs unfinished. For a long moment, the 2 groups faced each other. 5 men on horseback against 1 man with a rifle, and an elderly woman who refused to be intimidated. The tension stretched taut, ready to snap. Then one of the drifters shifted in his saddle, and Martha saw his hand move toward the pistol at his hip. Silas saw it too, and raised his rifle in one smooth motion. Don't, Silas warned. I've killed men for less cause than you're giving me right now. The drifter froze. Martha realized with a chill that Silas wasn't bluffing. The soldier who'd earned that tarnished medal was standing before her, prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect what he'd built. Jake seemed to realize it too. He pulled his horse back a step, reconsidering the situation. This isn't over, he said. You can't watch her every minute. Sooner or later you'll have to leave. And when you do, I'm not leaving, Silas interrupted. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until Thomas gets back from Laramie with official confirmation of Mrs. Brennan's legal ownership. And by then, enough people will know about this situation that anything that happens to her will point directly back to you. You'll hang for murder, Sutter. Is that timberland worth your neck? Jake's face went white with rage, but he couldn't find an answer to that. After a moment, he wheeled his horse around, and the others followed. But before they rode off, he turned back one last time. You're making powerful enemies, Creighton. Men with money and influence. Men who can make your life very difficult. My life's already difficult, Silas replied, and I've faced worse enemies than shopkeepers and cowards. Ride out before I decide you're trespassing and act accordingly. The 5 men disappeared into the trees, but the threat of their return hung in the air like smoke. Martha found herself shaking, adrenaline flooding through her system, now that the immediate danger had passed. They'll be back, she said. Yes. But now they know we're ready. That changes the calculation. Silas lowered his rifle but didn't relax his vigilance. They were testing us, seeing if we'd fold under pressure. We didn't. That matters. What do we do now? We prepare for a siege. We gather supplies, board up the windows if we have to, and we wait for Thomas to get back from Laramie. He looked at her seriously. Martha, the next 2 days are going to be the most dangerous. They might try to burn us out, might try to attack at night, might try a dozen different things. You need to be ready to fight for your home. I am ready, Martha said, and she meant it. She'd come too far, survived too much, to give up now. They spent the rest of the day fortifying their position. Silas showed Martha how to load and fire his spare pistol, made her practice until her hand stopped shaking and her aim was steady. They positioned water buckets around the cabin's exterior in case of fire, cleared brush away from the walls to eliminate hiding places for attackers, and established sight lines from the windows. As evening approached, Sarah Chen and Elizabeth Moore arrived with their husbands. They brought food, blankets, and most importantly, reinforcements. "We heard what happened," Sarah said. "Heard Jake Sutter threatening you. We're not going to stand by and let that happen." "This could get dangerous," Martha warned. "We know, but we should have stood up for you months ago. This is our chance to make that right." Elizabeth's husband, the minister, nodded in agreement. "The Bible teaches that we're supposed to defend the widow and the orphan. I've preached it enough times. Now I need to practice it." More people arrived as darkness fell. Robert Patterson and a handful of other men who'd worked Martha's land briefly, but had left for honest reasons rather than sabotage. They came with rifles and determination, forming a protective ring around the cabin. "My boy's putting his life at risk to help you," Robert said to Martha. "Least I can do is make sure he has something to come back to." By full dark, there were 15 people surrounding Martha's cabin, keeping watch in shifts, prepared to defend it through the night. Jake Sutter and his conspirators would find no easy target here. Silas pulled Martha aside as the watches were being organized. "See what you did?" he said quietly. "You didn't just build a cabin. You reminded people what community actually means. You gave them a reason to be better than they've been. I didn't do anything. You built the cabin. I built the walls. You built something more important. You built hope that things could change, that standing up to bullies was possible. That's why all these people are here. Not for the cabin, but for what the cabin represents." Martha looked around at the faces, illuminated by firelight, neighbors who'd finally become neighbors again, people who'd found their courage by watching hers. And she understood what Silas meant. This wasn't just about land or lumber or legal documents anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity, about refusing to let fear and greed define a community. It was about choosing to be the kind of people who helped each other instead of the kind who looked away. The night deepened, and the watches changed, and somewhere in the darkness, Jake Sutter and his men waited for their opportunity. But inside and around Martha Brennan's cabin, a different kind of force was gathering, the quiet, persistent strength of ordinary people who'd decided that enough was enough. And come morning, one way or another, the battle would be decided. Thomas arrived with the territorial marshal 3 hours after dawn, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. The boy had pushed through the night when he'd heard rumors of trouble in Timber Ridge, bringing help faster than anyone had dared hope. Marshal William Hodges was a weathered man in his 50s, with grey hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's worst. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment, the smouldering shed, the wounded men, the armed citizens still standing guard. "Someone want to tell me what happened here?" he asked. Martha stepped forward, and with Silas's steady presence beside her, she told the whole story. The conspiracy to steal her land, the 28 failed attempts to build her cabin, Silas's help, the discovery of the true deed, and finally the attack that had ended in violence. Marshal Hodges listened without interruption, then examined the documents Thomas had brought back from Laramie, now officially recorded and witnessed, legally unassailable proof of Martha's ownership. "These are in order," he confirmed. "Mrs. Brennan, you are the legal owner of 200 acres, including timber rights and water access. Anyone who tells you different is lying or ignorant." He turned to Jake Sutter, who sat on the ground, clutching his wounded leg, his face pale with shock and pain. "Jacob Sutter, I'm arresting you for attempted arson, assault with intent to harm, and conspiracy to defraud. Your friends there will face similar charges." He looked at Henry Pierce and Douglas Webb. "Gentlemen, you're looking at territorial prison, possibly 10 years or more." "She shot me," Jake protested. "That woman shot me in cold blood." "That woman defended her legally owned property from a man attempting to burn down her home," the marshal corrected. "That's not just legal, it's commendable. She showed more restraint than I would have. I'd have aimed higher." As the marshal and his deputy began securing the prisoners, Sarah Chen approached Martha with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry we didn't do this sooner. Sorry we let it get this far before standing with you." "You're here now," Martha replied, embracing the woman. "That's what matters." The doctor arrived to tend the wounded. Robert Patterson's shoulder was cleaned and bandaged, the bullet having passed through without hitting bone or major vessels. He'd recover fully, the doctor assured everyone, though he'd need to keep the arm in a sling for several weeks. Jake Sutter's leg wound was similarly treated, though the doctor's manner was considerably less gentle with a man who'd tried to burn down an elderly widow's home. "You'll live," he told Jake curtly, "though you'd have deserved worse." As the prisoners were loaded onto a wagon for transport to Laramie, Douglas Webb broke down, sobbing and begging for mercy. "It was Jake's idea," he pleaded. "He said the land was practically abandoned, that we'd just be filing proper claims. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know it would come to this." "You knew enough," Marshal Hodges said without sympathy. "You helped forge documents, spread lies, and stood by while good people were threatened. That makes you guilty, whether you pulled a trigger or not." Martha watched the wagon roll away, taking with it the men who'd tried to destroy her life. She should have felt triumph, satisfaction, vindication. Instead, she just felt tired and sad. Sad that greed could turn neighbors into enemies. Sad that it had taken violence to resolve what should have been handled through simple decency and respect for the law. Silas seemed to understand. He stood beside her as the wagon disappeared down the road, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "It's not the ending you wanted," he said quietly. "No, but it's the ending that was necessary." Martha turned to look at her cabin, standing solid in the morning light. "I just wanted a home. I didn't want to fight for it." Best things in life usually require fighting for. Doesn't make the fight pleasant, but it makes the reward more meaningful. Thomas approached them, looking exhausted but proud. "I brought the marshal as fast as I could. I'm sorry I wasn't here when—" "You did exactly what you needed to do," Martha interrupted, pulling the boy into a fierce hug. "You saved everything by getting those documents recorded. You were braver than any adult I know." Robert Patterson, his arm in a fresh sling, came to collect his son. "Thank you," he said to Silas, "for teaching him courage along with carpentry. And thank you," he turned to Martha, "for giving all of us a reason to remember what we should have been all along. People who stand together instead of apart." As the crowd began to disperse, heading back to their homes and lives with the crisis resolved, Martha found herself alone with Silas outside her cabin. The sun was fully up now, warming the cold ground, burning away the last wisps of smoke from the destroyed shed. "What happens now?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment, studying the cabin he'd built, the home he'd defended. Then he smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Now," he said, "you light a fire in that hearth and live the life you fought for. You make it a real home, not just a structure. You fill it with the things that matter: warmth, food, maybe friends who visit. You prove that all of this was worth it." Martha looked at the cabin, at the door bearing her carved initials, at the smoke rising gently from the chimney, and she knew he was right. The battle was over. The real work of living could finally begin. 2 weeks after the attack, the first real snow fell on the valley. Heavy, wet flakes that blanketed everything in white and settled in for the long winter ahead. Martha woke in her cabin, her home, to the gentle sound of snow sliding off the roof and the crackle of embers in the hearth. She rose from the bed Silas had built and placed near the fireplace for maximum warmth, wrapped herself in Samuel's old shawl, and added wood to the fire. The cabin filled with light and heat, chasing away the morning chill. Through the small window, she could see the world transformed into something clean and new, all traces of the battle erased beneath pristine snow. Footsteps outside announced a visitor. Martha opened the door to find Silas standing there with fresh firewood and a brace of rabbits he'd trapped that morning. "Morning," he said, stamping snow from his boots before entering. "Thought you might need these." "You didn't have to," Martha protested, though she was grateful. "You've done more than enough already." "Told you I'd stay until you were settled. You're not settled yet. Winter's just starting." He set the firewood by the hearth and hung the rabbits on a hook Silas had installed for that purpose. "Besides, I've gotten used to having somewhere to go that isn't just my lonely camp in the high country." Martha smiled, understanding what he wasn't quite saying. Silas had found something here. Purpose, maybe, or connection, or simply a reason to be part of the world again. Whatever it was, she was glad he'd found it. Thomas arrived mid-morning, as he did most days now that his chores at home were finished. His father had given permission for him to continue learning from Silas, and the boy was flourishing under the attention and instruction. "Ma sent bread," Thomas announced, presenting a warm loaf wrapped in cloth, "and she wants to know if you're still planning to teach her about bread making next week." "I am," Martha confirmed. "Tell her to come Tuesday afternoon, and bring anyone else who's interested. We'll make a proper lesson of it." It had become a pattern over the past 2 weeks. The women of Timber Ridge coming to Martha's cabin to learn recipes from her book, to share their own knowledge, to rebuild the community connections that had frayed over the years. Martha taught them cooking techniques passed down through generations, and in return, they brought her supplies, companionship, and the warmth of belonging. Silas spent the morning teaching Thomas how to build a proper chair, showing him the joinery that would make it strong enough to last decades. Martha worked on her own tasks, preparing the rabbit stew for their midday meal, organizing the dried herbs and preserved foods that lined her shelves, adding new recipes to her book. The cabin had become exactly what she'd hoped for, a home filled with purpose and life. The single room felt spacious rather than cramped, everything arranged with the efficiency that came from Silas's careful planning. Her bed in one corner, the table and chairs near the fireplace, shelves and storage built into every available space. The rocking chair Silas had crafted as a surprise sat by the hearth, and Martha spent her evenings there, sometimes reading by firelight, sometimes just watching the flames and feeling grateful. That afternoon, Robert Patterson stopped by with news from town. The trial of Jake Sutter and his co-conspirators had been swift and decisive. All 3 men had been sentenced to territorial prison. 10 years for Jake, 8 for Henry Pierce, 6 for Douglas Webb. The drifters who'd participated in the attack received lighter sentences in exchange for testifying against the ringleaders. "Town's changing," Robert said, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. "People are ashamed of how we acted, how we let things get to this point. There's talk of forming a proper community council, one that looks after folks instead of looking the other way." "That's good," Martha said. "That's how it should be." "And there's been inquiries about your timber," Robert added. "Legitimate companies interested in fair deals, not theft. If you wanted to sell some of those trees, you could be quite comfortable financially." Martha glanced at Silas, who'd been quietly listening. "What do you think?" "I think it's your land and your decision," he replied. "But I'd say this. Don't sell anything you're not ready to part with. You've got time now. No need to rush into deals just because people are offering." "Wise advice," Robert agreed. He stood to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Brennan, I want you to know. What you did, standing up the way you did, it reminded a lot of us what courage looks like. My boy's different now because of it. Better. And I'm grateful for that." After Robert left, the three of them, Martha, Silas, and Thomas, shared the rabbit stew. It had become their routine, this midday meal together, the conversation ranging from practical matters of survival to deeper questions about life and purpose, and what made a person truly wealthy. "My teacher asked us to write about someone we admire," Thomas said between bites. "I wrote about both of you, about how you built something important when everyone said it was impossible." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. "That's very kind, Thomas." "It's true," the boy insisted. "You taught me that giving up is a choice, not a requirement, and that's worth more than anything else I could learn." As evening approached and Thomas headed home, Silas lingered by the fire. He'd been doing that more often lately, staying later, seeming reluctant to return to his solitary existence in the high country. "Silas," Martha said carefully, "you know you don't have to keep coming down here every day. I can manage on my own now." "I know you can," he replied. "Question is whether I want to go back to managing on my own." They looked at each other across the cabin that had brought them together, two people who'd been broken by loss and isolation, who'd found unexpected connection through the simple act of building shelter. "This cabin needs more than one person in it to truly be a home," Martha said softly. "Room enough for a cranky old widow and a stubborn mountain man who's forgotten how to be alone." Silas smiled, that rare expression that made him look years younger. "Might be room for a boy learning carpentry, too. Someone needs to teach him properly, and his pa's willing to share him a few days a week." "A family, then," Martha said. "Not the traditional kind, but a family nonetheless." "The best kind," Silas agreed. "The kind you choose." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in silence and peace. Inside Martha Brennan's cabin, the fire burned warm and steady, light spilling from the windows into the gathering darkness. And three people who'd been lost in different ways had found each other, and, in finding each other, had found themselves. The cabin stood solid against the winter, exactly as Silas had promised it would. But more than that, it stood as a symbol of what persistence and courage could accomplish. 28 men had said it couldn't be done. One man had proven them wrong. And in the process, he'd given an elderly widow more than just shelter. He'd given her back her dignity, her hope, and her belief that the world still held kindness for those brave enough to ask for it. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges and opportunities. But for now, in the depth of winter, Martha Brennan was home. And home, she'd learned, wasn't just a place. It was the people you chose to share it with, the warmth you created together, and the stubborn refusal to let hardship define your story. She'd asked for a cabin. She'd received far more than that. She'd received a second chance at life, and she intended to make the most of it. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the valley as winter settled in for the duration. But inside, by the fire, Martha sat in her rocking chair with her recipe book open on her lap, adding new entries for the meals she'd share with her chosen family. Silas worked on carving something at the table. A gift, he said, but wouldn't elaborate. And somewhere in Timber Ridge, Thomas Patterson was writing in his journal about the two people who'd taught him that strength came not from never falling, but from getting back up every single time. The mountain man had finished the cabin and left them speechless. But he hadn't left at all. He'd stayed, and in staying, he'd found what he'd lost 15 years ago, a reason to build, a reason to teach, a reason to believe that some things were worth the effort of trying. And that, Martha thought, as she gazed into the dancing flames, was the real miracle. Not the cabin itself, but what the cabin had made possible: connection, community, family, hope. The fire crackled, the snow fell, and the cabin stood firm, home at last.